Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking along an ancient road at twilight. The day's heat is fading, replaced by the cool embrace of evening. Above you, the first stars are beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. The road beneath your feet is worn smooth by countless travelers who have passed this way before you. Somewhere ahead, at a crossroads, stands a stone marker. A herm, they call it, weathered by time but still standing guard. As you approach, you notice offerings left by other travelers. A small coin, some bread, a sprig of herbs. The air smells of dust and a wild thyme. A nightbird calls in the distance. You are not alone on this road. You feel a presence, swift and protective, watching over all who journey here. This is Hermes' domain, the space between destinations, the threshold between one place and another, the moment suspended between day and night. Here, in this liminal space where boundaries blur and transitions happen, you are safe. The messenger god watches over travelers, and tonight, you travel through the realm of sleep, toward the land of dreams. Let the swift god guide you, as he has guided countless souls across countless thresholds, with wings on his heels and protection in his staff. Now, let us journey together through the fascinating story of Hermes, the most versatile and clever of all the Olympian gods. Threvisure, born in a cave, the miraculous infant. The story of Hermes begins, as so many divine stories do, with Zeus and his wandering eye. The king of gods had a particular talent for finding beautiful partners in unlikely places, and Maya, eldest of the seven Pleiades, caught his attention in the most perfect hiding spot she could have chosen. Maya was daughter of the Titan Atlas, who held the sky on his shoulders as punishment for his role in the war against the Olympians. Through her mother Pleione, she was part of that ancient generation that predated even the Olympians themselves. Unlike many nymphs who dwelled in glades or rivers or among the company of other gods, Maya preferred solitude. She made her home in a deep cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, high in the mountains where few gods or mortals ventured. It was a perfect retreat for a goddess who valued privacy above all else. The cave was comfortable, shadowy, and remote, qualities that made it attractive not just to Maya, but eventually to Zeus as well. Zeus, in his endless romantic adventures, had learned to be discreet when his wife Hera's jealousy was concerned. He visited Maya in the dead of night, when Hera lay fast asleep in their marriage bed on Mount Olympus. The secrecy was crucial. Hera's wrath toward Zeus's lovers and their children was legendary, and Zeus had no desire to expose gentle Maya to that fury. In the darkness and privacy of the cave, Zeus and Maya became lovers, and in due course, Maya became pregnant. The Homeric hymn to Hermes, one of our most detailed ancient sources for this story, tells us that when Maya's time came, she gave birth in that same cave where she had been conceived. The exact timing varies slightly in different sources, but all agree on one crucial detail. Hermes was unlike any other infant, god, or mortal who had ever been born. While most babies, even divine babies, needed time to grow and develop, Hermes was born fully conscious, precociously intelligent, and immediately ready to cause trouble. According to the Homeric hymn, Hermes was born at dawn, and by midday was already playing the lyre, demonstrating talents he had literally invented hours after birth. But his most famous exploit came that same evening, mere hours after he entered the world. This was no ordinary child. This was a god who would grow up to embody speed, cleverness, and the transgression of boundaries. Maya, exhausted from childbirth, wrapped her newborn son in swaddling clothes. Those traditional tie bindings used to keep infants still and calm. Placed him in a winnowing basket that served as a cradle and fell asleep. She expected her baby to sleep as well. She was wrong. Hermes, lying in his makeshift cradle, looked around the cave with eyes far too aware for a newborn. He wriggled, twisted, and within moments had freed himself from the swaddling clothes. Then, with the determination of someone on a mission, he crawled to the cave entrance and escaped into the world. The first thing Hermes encountered outside the cave was a tortoise waddling slowly at the threshold. A normal infant might have ignored it, or perhaps tried to grab it. Hermes saw an opportunity for innovation. He killed the tortoise, not out of cruelty, but with the practical efficiency of someone who sees potential where others see only an animal. He hollowed out the shell, stretched cowhide across it, attached arms made from reeds, and strung it with sheep gut. Thus, within hours of his birth, Hermes invented the lyre, the musical instrument that would become sacred to his half-brother Apollo and fundamental to Greek culture. But Hermes wasn't finished with his first day. After creating the lyre, he set out on a longer journey. Somehow, and the myths don't bother explaining how a hours-old infant managed this, Hermes traveled all the way to Pieria in Thessaly, where Apollo kept his sacred cattle. These weren't ordinary cows. They were divine animals, beautiful and precious, tended by the sun god himself as part of his many duties. Hermes, demonstrating the cunning that would define his character, didn't just steal the cattle. He stole them cleverly. He selected 50 of the best animal from Apollo's herd and drove them away. But he was careful about the method. To confuse anyone tracking them, Hermes forced the cattle to walk backwards, so their hoofprints would point the wrong direction. He also crafted special sandals for himself from myrtle branches and tamarisk, tying the plants to his feet to disguise his footprints. Think about what this scene represents. A god only hours old is already committing theft, but it's clever theft, thoughtful theft, theft that involves innovation and planning. This wasn't mindless crime. It was the work of a divine intelligence that understood boundaries, how to cross them, and how to avoid getting caught. Hermes drove the 50 cattle across a long distance, hiding them in a cave near the river Alpheus in the Peloponnese, far from where Apollo would expect to find them. Before hiding all the cattle, Hermes decided to make a sacrifice. This is where the story gets particularly interesting, because Hermes didn't just sacrifice to the gods. He invented the very ritual of sacrifice itself, according to some traditions. He slaughtered 2 of the 50 cattle, divided the meat into 12 portions, representing the 12 Olympian gods, and burnt offerings to each deity. Here's the crucial detail. Hermes made a portion for himself as well, suggesting he already knew he would take his place among the Olympians. After completing this ritual, Hermes hid the remaining cattle, disposed of any evidence of his activities, and hurried back to Mount Selene. When he arrived at dawn, he slipped back through the cave entrance, wrapped himself carefully in his swaddling clothes, and lay down in his winnowing basket cradle, looking for all the world like an innocent newborn who had never left his mother's side. Meanwhile, Apollo had discovered that his cattle were missing. As God of prophecy, Apollo possessed the ability to divine what had happened. He traced the theft back to the cave on Mount Cilion and arrived furious, ready to demand justice from whoever had stolen his sacred animals. He found Maya just waking up and he accused her infant son of the theft. Maya, looking at her baby lying peacefully swaddled in his cradle, was incredulous. She pointed to Hermes and essentially said, "Does this look like a cattle thief to you? He's a newborn. He was born yesterday. How could he possibly have stolen your cattle? I don't even think he knows what cattle are." It was a perfectly reasonable defense. No one would suspect a hours-old infant of traveling hundreds of miles, stealing 50 head of cattle, and hiding them after inventing a new form of sacrifice. It was absurd, except Apollo wasn't fooled. His prophetic abilities had shown him the truth, and he knew exactly who and what Hermes was, despite appearances. Unable to get Maya to admit her son's guilt, Apollo took the matter to Zeus. He appeared before the king of gods with baby Hermes in tow and demanded his cattle be returned. The scene that followed is one of the most delightful in all Greek mythology. Zeus, amused by the situation, asked Hermes to explain himself. Hermes, maintaining his innocent act, looked up at his father with wide eyes and protested, "I was born yesterday. How could I possibly steal anyone's cattle? I don't even know what cattle are. Look at me. I'm just a baby. I've been lying in my cradle the entire time. This god comes in here accusing me of impossible things, and now I'm being brought before you like I'm some kind of criminal. It's not fair." His performance was Oscar-worthy. He played the part of wronged innocence perfectly, even managing to suggest that Apollo was being unreasonable for accusing such an obviously helpless infant. Zeus, of course, knew better. As king of gods, he could see through any deception, and, moreover, he had divine knowledge of what had actually happened. But something about this situation, perhaps Hermes' sheer audacity, perhaps his cleverness, perhaps Zeus seeing something of himself in this precocious child, amused him greatly. Zeus, smiling despite himself, ordered Hermes to stop pretending and show Apollo where the cattle were hidden. Hermes, recognizing that the game was up, abandoned his innocent act and led Apollo to the cave where he'd hidden the remaining 48 cows. Apollo counted them, noted that 2 were missing, and prepared to demand full restitution. But then Hermes did something unexpected. He pulled out the lyre he'd invented that morning and began to play it. His fingers moved across the strings, drawing out sounds no one had ever heard before because the instrument itself had never existed before that day. The music was beautiful, enchanting, unlike anything Apollo or any other god had experienced. And Apollo, who would become the god most associated with music and the arts, was immediately captivated. Apollo stopped demanding justice for his cattle. Instead, he stared at the lyre, listened to the sounds Hermes created, and fell completely in love with the instrument. "That song," Apollo told Hermes, "is worth 50 cattle. I've never heard anything like it. Where did you get that marvelous thing?" And here Hermes revealed his genius for negotiation. He explained how he'd made the lyre, emphasizing his own cleverness and creativity. Then he offered Apollo a trade, the lyre, in exchange for keeping the cattle. Apollo, who couldn't imagine life without this new instrument, immediately agreed. The god of prophecy and light traded his sacred herd for a musical instrument invented by a one-day-old baby. It was perhaps the greatest bit of bartering in mythological history. But Hermes wasn't done. Later, while tending the remaining cattle that were now his, Hermes invented another instrument, panpipes, which the Greeks called a syrinx. He made it from reeds and began playing it while watching the cows. Apollo, hearing the new music, came to investigate and fell in love with this instrument too. He wanted it desperately, but Hermes had learned his negotiating power. He offered Apollo the panpipes in exchange for Apollo's golden staff, which the sun god used while herding cattle. But Hermes wanted more than just the staff. He wanted knowledge of prophecy as well. Apollo agreed to the trade, but with a significant caveat. He couldn't give Hermes full prophetic powers. Those belonged to Apollo alone. But he could teach Hermes divination through the Threae, bee nymphs who practiced a particular form of prophecy. He gave Hermes the golden staff, which would become one of the god's most iconic symbols, and granted him limited prophetic abilities. In some versions, this staff later transformed into the famous caduceus when two serpents wrapped around it. Zeus, watching all these negotiations and impressed by his youngest son's cleverness, business acumen, and ability to turn disaster into profit, made a decision. He officially proclaimed Hermes to be his herald and messenger. This was an important position. The messenger of the gods would need to be quick. Hermes demonstrated this. Clever, obviously. Trustworthy, despite the cattle theft, or perhaps because of it. And able to cross boundaries between realms, both metaphorically and literally. Zeus also gave Hermes additional responsibilities. He would be the only god with the right to travel between Olympus, Earth, and the underworld. He would watch over herds and flocks. He would preside over commerce and trade, given his demonstrated talent for negotiation, and somewhat ironically given that the meeting started with him being accused of theft. He would become the patron god of thieves, because who better to understand thieves than the god who started his life stealing Apollo's cattle? The Homeric hymn to Hermes ends with Hermes and Apollo becoming friends, with the older god acknowledging that this newest Olympian was someone special. Zeus embraced his son and welcomed him to Mount Olympus, making Hermes one of the 12 Olympian gods, despite being, as he would often be described, the youngest of them all, excluding only Dionysus, who came even later. This birth story establishes everything we need to know about Hermes' character. He was clever from the moment of birth, literally from his first hours of life. He was a trickster who saw boundaries as things to cross rather than barriers to respect. He was an inventor who could create new things, the lyre, the panpipes, the method of sacrifice, on the fly. He was a skilled negotiator who could turn theft into legitimate business. And he was quick. Not just physically, it would become his trademark as he received his famous winged sandals, but mentally, always thinking several steps ahead. The Greeks loved this story because it captured something essential about their own values. They admired cleverness, valued intelligence over brute force, appreciated innovative thinking, and understood that sometimes the best way to get ahead was to take chances and cross boundaries that others respected. Hermes, the god who started his life, stealing cattle and ended it as Zeus's trusted messenger, embodied all of these qualities. He was the divine trickster, the clever one, the god who could cross any boundary and talk his way out of any situation. And he was, from his first day alive, absolutely fascinating. Swift as thought, messenger of the gods. The role of messenger might sound simple, carry messages from one place to another. But in the context of Greek mythology, where the gods' messages could determine the fates of cities, the lives of heroes, and the outcomes of wars, being the divine herald was anything but simple. It required speed, certainly, but also diplomacy, trustworthiness, perfect memory, and the ability to move between worlds that were normally separated by impassable barriers. Hermes excelled at all of these. Zeus granted Hermes several divine gifts to help him fulfill his role as messenger. The most famous of these were the talaria, or winged sandals, which allowed Hermes to fly through the air and move with incredible speed. These weren't ordinary wings. They sprouted directly from the sandals, or in some depictions from Hermes' ankles themselves, giving the god the power to travel anywhere instantaneously. With the talaria, Hermes could fly from the peak of Mount Olympus to the deepest reaches of the underworld, from the eastern edge of the world to the western, covering distances that would take other gods considerable time. Along with the winged sandals, Hermes received a petasos, a wide-brimmed traveler's hat that, in artistic depictions, is often shown with wings as well. This hat marked him as a traveler, someone constantly on the move, never settling in one place for long. It was practical protection from sun and rain, but it was also symbolic. Hermes was the god of roads and journeys, and he wore the uniform of those who traveled them. Most importantly, Hermes carried the kerykeion, which the Romans would later call the caduceus. This was his herald staff, the symbol of his authority as Zeus's messenger. In its earliest forms, the staff was made of olive wood, with various ribbons or garlands attached. Later traditions described it as golden, and in its most famous version, 2 serpents were entwined around it. The story of how the snakes came to be on the staff varies. One version claims Hermes found 2 serpents fighting and placed his staff between them to make peace, whereupon they wrapped around it. Another tradition says the serpents represented wisdom and eloquence, the 2 qualities most essential to a messenger. The caduceus had several powers. It could put people to sleep or wake them up, which was useful for a messenger who sometimes needed to deliver urgent messages to sleeping recipients or needed to pass by guards undetected. It also provided safe passage. When Hermes carried the caduceus, he could not be harmed, even by hostile forces. The staff marked him as a herald, and even during warfare, heralds were considered neutral parties who could pass between enemy lines. This diplomatic immunity extended to Hermes in all circumstances. Armed with these symbols and tools, Hermes served as Zeus's chief messenger, but he also carried messages for other gods when needed. The role required him to be constantly available, always ready to fly off on a new assignment, perpetually in motion. Ancient writers described Hermes as swift as thought, because that's essentially what he was, the physical manifestation of communication itself, capable of moving between minds and realms as quickly as an idea travels from one person to another. One of the most famous messages Hermes delivered involved King Priam of Troy during the Trojan War. The old king wanted to retrieve the body of his son Hector, who had been killed by the Greek hero Achilles, and whose corpse Achilles had been dragging around the Greek camp in rage and grief. It was a dangerous mission, Priam would have to enter the enemy camp alone, face the man who killed his son, and somehow persuade Achilles to give up the body. Zeus took pity on Priam and sent Hermes to guide him safely through the Greek lines. The messenger god appeared to Priam disguised as a young Greek warrior and offered to escort him. Priam, not recognizing the god, accepted gratefully. Hermes led the old king through the Greek sentries, making them all fall asleep so Priam could pass undetected. He guided Priam directly to Achilles' tent, then revealed his divine identity, and left the king to complete his mission. This story illustrates several important aspects of Hermes' role. He could move undetected when necessary, using his powers to send guards to sleep. He could take on disguises, appearing as a mortal when useful. He showed compassion toward the mortals he assisted, treating Priam with gentle respect, and he operated on Zeus's orders, carrying out the will of the king of gods, even when it meant helping Troy, which Zeus had ultimately doomed to fall. Another crucial message delivery happened in Homer's Odyssey, when the hero Odysseus had been trapped for 7 years on the island of the nymph Calypso. She had fallen in love with Odysseus and was keeping him as a virtual prisoner, even as he longed to return home to his wife Penelope and his kingdom of Ithaca. Zeus finally decided to intervene and sent Hermes to Calypso with orders. She must let Odysseus go. Hermes flew across the sea to Calypso's remote island, delivered Zeus's message, and waited for her response. Calypso protested. She loved Odysseus and had offered him immortality if he would stay with her forever. But Hermes was firm. Zeus commanded it, and the nymph had no choice but to obey. Through Hermes' intervention, Odysseus was finally free to begin his journey home. The message was simple, but its consequences were enormous. It set in motion the events of the last section of the Odyssey. Hermes also delivered messages that involved more than just communication. Sometimes he was tasked with enforcement or rescue operations. When the monstrous giant Argus Panoptes, the all-seeing, was set to guard Io, a woman Zeus loved who had been transformed into a cow, Hermes received orders to free her. Argus had 100 eyes placed all over his body, and these eyes never all closed at once. Some were always awake and watching, making him the perfect guard. Hermes approached the giant and began telling him stories, playing his panpipes, trying to lull all 100 eyes to sleep. The god talked and played music for hours, patiently waiting as one eye after another slowly closed. Finally, after an exhaustingly long performance, the last of Argus's eyes shut. Hermes immediately drew his sword and killed the giant, beheading him before any eyes could reopen. Hera, who had set Argus to guard Io, honored the faithful giant by taking his 100 eyes and placing them in the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock. Ever after, this killing earned Hermes the epithet Argefontes, slayer of Argus. As messenger, Hermes also dealt with diplomatic missions between gods. When conflicts arose on Olympus, when alliances needed forging, when delicate negotiations required an intermediary, Hermes was the go-to god. He had a talent for smoothing over disagreements, finding common ground, and helping parties communicate who might otherwise refuse to speak to each other. This diplomatic skill made him invaluable not just to Zeus, but to the entire pantheon. Interestingly, Hermes' role as messenger extended beyond just the gods. He also became the patron of heralds, those mortal messengers who carried word between kingdoms. announced important news, and served as diplomats during wars. In ancient Greece, heralds were considered sacred. They could not be harmed, even by enemies, because they were under Hermes' protection. This concept of diplomatic immunity, that messengers should be allowed to travel safely, even through hostile territory, originated with Hermes' own role and the divine protection he extended to those who emulated it. The god also became associated with eloquence and persuasive speech, skills essential for any messenger. A herald had to deliver messages accurately, yes, but also persuasively, making sure the recipient understood not just the words, but the intent behind them. Hermes could charm with his speech, convince skeptics, calm angry recipients, and present even unwelcome news in ways that encouraged acceptance. Ancient orators, those professional speakers who argued cases in courts or delivered speeches in assemblies, considered Hermes their patron god. From Hermes' association with messages and communication came another important domain, language itself. Some traditions credited Hermes with inventing writing, or at least bringing it to humanity. This made sense symbolically. Writing was a technology for preserving and transmitting messages across time and space, doing on a permanent basis what Hermes did temporarily. The connection between the messenger god and written language was so strong that the modern word hermeneutics, the interpretation of texts, derives directly from his name. In philosophical and religious thought, Hermes represented something even more abstract, the principle of connection between separated things. He was the bridge between Olympus and Earth, between gods and humans, between life and death, between one moment and the next. Communication itself is a kind of bridging, connecting one mind to another, and Hermes personified this fundamental human need to reach across distance and difference. His speed wasn't just physical. Ancient writers often described Hermes as swift as thought, because thoughts themselves move instantaneously from one topic to another, from one person to another when spoken, from one time to another when written. Hermes, flying through the air on winged sandals, was the perfect symbol for how quickly ideas and information could travel when properly transmitted. In artistic depictions, Hermes is almost always shown in motion. He's walking, flying, running, never still, never seated, never at rest. This reflected his role perfectly. A messenger is always between destinations, always moving from one place to another, perpetually in transit. Even his birth story emphasized this quality. He was born and, within hours, was traveling vast distances, unable or unwilling to stay in one place. The Greeks' love of Hermes as messenger reflected their own sophisticated communication networks. Ancient Greece wasn't a unified nation, but a collection of independent city-states spread across the Mediterranean. Communication between them was vital for trade, for diplomacy, for cultural exchange, for war. Hermes, the god who made communication possible, was honoring something the Greeks valued deeply: the ability to connect across distances, to bridge differences, to make ideas and news travel faster than human feet alone could carry them. In our modern world, we might see echoes of Hermes in our communication technologies. The internet carries messages at literal light speed. Our phones keep us constantly connected. Social media creates instant global conversations. These are the modern equivalent of Hermes' winged sandals. technologies that collapse distance and make communication almost instantaneous. The ancient Greeks understood, even without our technology, that communication itself was a kind of divine power, worthy of its own god and of reverent respect. Hermes, the swift messenger with wings on his heels, represents humanity's eternal desire to reach beyond our physical limitations, to connect with those far away, to make our voices heard across any distance. In this role, he remains as relevant today as he was 3,000 years ago. We are all in our constant communication, our endless messaging, our digital conversations, following in the footsteps of the god with winged sandals, trying to bridge distances, trying to be understood, trying to deliver our messages from one mind to another as swiftly as thought itself. The divine trickster, protector of thieves. Perhaps no aspect of Hermes' character is more delightfully contradictory than his role as patron god of thieves. Here was a deity trusted as Zeus's personal messenger, granted access to every realm in the cosmos, given the responsibility of safely delivering the god's most important communications. And yet, he was also the divine protector of thieves, liars, and those who made their living through deception and stealth. This paradox wasn't a flaw in Greek mythology. It was entirely intentional and deeply meaningful. Hermes' association with thievery began, as we've seen, on his very first day of life. By stealing Apollo's cattle, he established himself immediately as a thief. And not just any thief, but a clever one who could plan ahead, cover his tracks, and talk his way out of consequences. This first act defined his character. Hermes was a trickster, someone who saw rules and boundaries as challenges to overcome, rather than limits to respect. But why would the Greeks honor a god of thieves? Theft was illegal in ancient Greek society, just as it is today. Thieves were punished, not celebrated. Yet Hermes, the divine thief, was one of the most beloved gods in the pantheon. To understand this contradiction, we need to understand what Hermes' thievery actually represented in Greek cultural thought. Hermes wasn't the god of violent robbery or destructive crime. He wasn't associated with the kind of thievery that hurt innocent people or destroyed livelihoods. Instead, he represented clever theft, cunning acquisition, the art of getting what you want through wit rather than force. His thefts were always performed with style, intelligence, and often a sense of humor. When he stole Apollo's cattle, he did it with such creativity. The backwards hoofprints, the special sandals, and the invention of sacrifice, that even Apollo had to admire the cleverness. In Greek culture, cleverness was highly valued. The Greeks called it meta, a kind of practical intelligence that combined cunning, wisdom, and street smarts. Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, was celebrated precisely for his metae, his ability to think his way out of problems, to trick enemies, to survive through cunning rather than brute force. Hermes embodied this same quality in divine form. He was the god of metas applied to acquisition and movement across boundaries. Boundaries were crucial to us understanding Hermes' role. He was fundamentally the god of liminality, of thresholds, transitions, and in-between spaces. Thieves, in this framework, were people who crossed boundaries they shouldn't cross, from outside to inside, from someone else's property to their own possession, from law-abiding to law-breaking. Hermes, as god of all boundary crossings, naturally became their patron. But Hermes wasn't just about literal theft. He represented all kinds of boundary transgression. He was god of roads, those spaces between one place and another. He was god of dusk and dawn, the times between day and night. He was psychopomp, guide between life and death. He was messenger between gods and mortals. Everywhere you looked, Hermes existed in liminal spaces, in the gaps between categories. Theft was simply one more way of crossing a boundary that society said should not be crossed. This is why Hermes could be both trustworthy messenger and patron of thieves, without contradiction. As a messenger, he crossed boundaries officially, with divine sanction. As a thief's patron, he recognized that sometimes boundaries must be crossed unofficially, through cunning and stealth. Both roles acknowledged the same truth. Boundaries existed to be traversed, and Hermes was the god who made that traversal possible. Many of Hermes' most famous myths involved clever theft or trickery. When Zeus needed someone to steal back his stolen sinews from the monster Typhon, he sent Hermes. The story goes that Typhon, that gigantic serpent monster who once challenged Zeus for control of the cosmos, had defeated Zeus in their first battle and torn the sinews from Zeus's arms and legs, leaving the king of gods helpless. Typhon hid the sinews in a cave, guarded by the dragon Delphine. Hermes, demonstrating the qualities that made him patron of thieves, managed to sneak past Delphine, retrieve the sinews, and return them to Zeus. How did he do it? The myths don't give us details, but presumably through a combination of speed, stealth, cleverness, and his ability to move undetected. This was more than just theft. It was a rescue mission, saving Zeus and preserving the cosmic order. The skills of a thief served divine purposes. On another occasion, Hermes was tasked with freeing Ares from imprisonment. The war god had been captured by two giants, Otis and Ephialtes, who stuffed him into a bronze jar and left him there for 13 months. Ares, for all his might and violence, couldn't break free. Hermes, using stealth and cunning, found where Ares was imprisoned and rescued him, not through force. Hermes wasn't a combat god, but through cleverness and quick action. These myths established a pattern. When someone needed to be freed from imprisonment, when something needed to be retrieved from impossible to reach places, when a heist was required rather than a battle, the gods called on Hermes. He was the divine specialist in impossible thefts, the god you summoned when you needed something stolen that couldn't be taken by force. Hermes also served as patron to famous mortal thieves. His son, Autolycus, whose mother was Chione, a daughter of King Daedalian, inherited his father's talents and became the most successful thief in Greek mythology. Hermes granted Autolycus special powers. He could make whatever he stole unrecognizable, and he could shapeshift himself as needed to avoid detection. Autolycus could steal your favorite horse, and when you saw it the next day in his stable, you wouldn't recognize it because it now looked completely different. He could steal your cattle and alter their appearance so dramatically that you'd walk past your own animals without knowing them. Autolycus used these gifts extensively, becoming wealthy through theft. The interesting thing is that the myths don't particularly condemn him for this. Instead, they celebrate his cleverness, treating his thefts as demonstrations of impressive skill rather than moral failings. He eventually became the maternal grandfather of Odysseus, suggesting that the trickster qualities ran in the family line. Odysseus's famous cunning, his ability to deceive enemies and think his way out of impossible situations, was inherited partly from his grandfather Autolycus and ultimately from Hermes himself. But Hermes didn't just patronize thieves who stole objects. He also protected those who used cunning and deception in other ways. Con artists, gamblers, those who lived by their wits rather than physical labor, all fell under Hermes' protection. The Greeks sometimes called him Hermes Dolios, Hermes the deceiver, acknowledging this aspect of his nature without particular judgment. Dolos, the Greek word for trickery or craft, wasn't entirely negative. It could also mean clever skill, the kind of intelligence that lets you see solutions others miss. In ancient Greek society, especially in cities like Athens, people's attitudes toward Hermes' trickster nature were complex. On one hand, theft and deception were illegal and condemned. On the other hand, the Greeks admired cleverness so much that they couldn't help but appreciate a well-executed trick, even when it technically broke laws. Hermes represented this cultural ambivalence, the recognition that rules were necessary, but that breaking them cleverly was sometimes admirable or at least entertaining. The Hermes that stood at crossroads and boundaries throughout ancient Greece sometimes included inscriptions asking Hermes to protect travelers, but also to grant good luck in commerce and occasionally success in risky ventures. Gambler might pray to Hermes before throwing dice. Hermes was said to have invented gambling. A merchant negotiating a deal might invoke Hermes to help make the arrangement successful, even if the deal involved some degree of deception or manipulation. And yes, a thief planning a heist might ask Hermes for assistance, for stealth, for quick feet, for luck in avoiding detection. This brings us to an interesting philosophical point. Hermes, as patron of thieves, wasn't really about encouraging crime. He was about acknowledging that human life involved crossing boundaries, physical, social, moral, and that sometimes those crossings happened in unauthorized ways. Hermes didn't judge these crossings. He simply recognized them as part of the human experience and offered divine protection to those brave or foolish enough to attempt them. The trickster archetype that Hermes embodied appears in many cultures. There's Loki in Norse mythology, Anansi in West African and Caribbean folklore, Coyote in Native American traditions, Reynard the Fox in European stories. All of these figures share certain qualities. They're clever rather than strong. They use deception and cunning. They break rules and cross boundaries. They often help humanity, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. And they're simultaneously admirable and morally questionable. Hermes fits this pattern perfectly. What makes tricksters valuable both in mythology and in cultural thinking is that they question norms. By breaking rules cleverly, tricksters expose which rules are truly necessary and which are arbitrary. By crossing boundaries, they reveal that boundaries aren't natural features of the world, but human constructions that can be challenged. Hermes, stealing cattle on his first day of life and negotiating his way into becoming Zeus's messenger, demonstrated that even divine order was flexible, that cleverness could rewrite rules, that a child born yesterday could become one of the 12 Olympians through sheer audacity. The Greeks understood something important through Hermes. Civilization requires rules and boundaries, yes, but it also requires people who can see past those rules, who can think creatively, who can find new solutions to old problems. Thieves, in a sense, were practicing an extreme form of creative thinking, finding ways to acquire things through methods society didn't sanction. That same creative thinking, channeled differently, led to innovation, art, philosophy, and progress. So, when the Greeks worshipped Hermes as patron of thieves, they weren't really encouraging theft. They were honoring cleverness, celebrating the trickster spirit that challenges orthodoxy, and acknowledging that boundaries, while necessary, are also made to be crossed by those brave and smart enough to do so. Hermes, the divine thief with wings on his heels, represented the exciting, dangerous, creative spirit of transgression that every society both fears and needs. God of the marketplace, protector of merchants and trade. From stealing cattle to overseeing all commerce in ancient Greece might seem like an odd career progression, but for Hermes it made perfect sense. The same qualities that made him an excellent thief: cunning, quick thinking, ability to negotiate, understanding of value and exchange, made him the natural patron god of merchants and trade. The Greeks saw this connection clearly. Commerce, like theft, involved the crossing of boundaries and the clever acquisition of goods, just through legal and mutually agreed upon channels. Hermes' association with commerce began with that first theft and subsequent negotiation. When he traded Apollo his newly invented lyre for the stolen cattle, Hermes was essentially inventing commercial exchange, trading one valuable thing for another, both parties walking away satisfied, or at least willing to accept the deal. This first transaction set the pattern for all future commerce. Identify what others want, determine what you have that they'll trade for, negotiate until you reach an acceptable exchange. Hermes did all of this while still technically a newborn. The ancient Greek economy was deeply embedded in religious practice, and economic activities required divine sanction and protection. The agora, the marketplace that was the heart of every Greek city, was a sacred space where multiple gods held influence. But Hermes was among the most important. He was called Hermes Agoreus, Hermes of the Agora, and his statues and Hermes stood throughout market spaces, blessing the commercial activities taking place around them. Merchants engaged in a risky business in the ancient world. They transported goods over long distances, whether by sea or by land, facing dangers from weather, pirates, bandits, and simple bad luck. They negotiated with strangers in foreign lands, trying to get fair prices without knowing local customs or being able to fully trust their trading partners. They made deals based on promises, shipping goods in exchange for future payment, or accepting payment for goods they'd yet to deliver. All of this required a god who understood both risk and reward, who could protect travelers and guide negotiators, who presided over the art of the deal. Hermes was perfect for this role. As god of roads and travel, he watched over merchants' journeys. As god of language and eloquence, he helped them negotiate successfully. As the trickster god, he understood both the clever dealing that made good business and the deceptions that merchants had to watch out for. As god of sudden good fortune, he could bless a merchant with unexpected profit. And as god of boundaries, he oversaw the crossing from one market to another, from one trading partner to another, from one economic state to another. The Greeks had a sophisticated understanding of commerce. They knew that trade created wealth, that when merchants bought goods cheaply in one place and sold them for more in another, they weren't just moving objects around, but were actually creating value through their knowledge, effort, and willingness to take risks. This value creation was a kind of magic, an almost divine transformation where goods became worth more simply by being moved and sold skillfully. Hermes, as god of this process, was essentially the god of profit itself. One of Hermes's most important commercial roles was as god of weights and measures. Honest commerce requires standardized ways to measure goods, whether by weight, volume, length, or value. Without agreed upon standards, every transaction becomes a potential for disagreement or fraud. Hermes, as god of fair exchange, oversaw the systems that made fair exchange possible. Merchants swore oaths by Hermes that their scales were honest, their measures accurate, their goods as represented. Breaking such an oath was not just fraud, but sacrilege, inviting divine punishment. This brings up an interesting point about Hermes' dual nature. He was god of honest merchants and patron of thieves. He oversaw fair dealing and clever deception. This seems contradictory until you realize that ancient Greeks saw commerce itself as existing on a spectrum between absolute honesty and outright fraud, with most actual trading happening somewhere in the middle. A good merchant was expected to drive a hard bargain, to know when to be generous and when to hold firm, to present goods in their best light without outright lying. These skills required the same cunning that a thief used, just channeled into legal and socially acceptable forms. Hermes was also god of sudden wealth, the lucky find, the unexpected profit, the deal that works out far better than anticipated. The Greeks had a phrase, hermaion, or hermeum in Latin, meaning a lucky find or windfall. If you discovered treasure, or if a business venture succeeded beyond expectations, or if money simply appeared in your life through fortunate circumstances, that was Hermes' gift. He was the god of good fortune in commercial matters, of being in the right place at the right time, of opportunities that appear and must be seized quickly. This association with luck led to Hermes' patronage of gambling, dice games, betting, any activity where chance determined profit or loss. These fell under Hermes' domain. Before rolling dice, ancient Greeks would invoke Hermes, sometimes drawing an olive leaf, his sacred plant, and throwing it along with the dice. The connection made sense. Gambling was like commerce condensed into a single moment, where risk and cunning combined with luck to determine who won and who lost. Hermes presided over both. The Herms themselves, those stone pillars that gave Hermes his name, had a crucial commercial function. They marked boundaries and crossroads. Yes, but they also served as landmarks for travelers and merchants. In a world without street signs or GPS, these permanent stone markers helped people navigate, telling them where roads met, where property lines lay, where towns began and ended. Merchants traveling unfamiliar roads relied on Hermes to know where they were going. The pillars were often erected at the city's edge, marking the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between one territory and another, and thus marking the places where commerce happened, where traders met to exchange goods. Many Herms also featured a distinctive element, a phallus carved into or protruding from the pillar. This might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but in ancient Greek religious thought, the phallus represented fertility, vitality, and generative power, the ability to create new life, or, by extension, new wealth. Hermes, as a fertility god, one of his many roles, was thus represented by this symbol. suggesting that the crossroads where commerce happened were places of creation and generation, where new economic relationships were born and wealth was created through exchange. Hermes' commercial protection extended beyond Greek borders. Ancient Mediterranean trade was international, with Greek merchants dealing with Egyptians, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, and countless other peoples. Hermes became associated with successful foreign trade, helping merchants navigate not just physical distances, but also cultural differences, language barriers, and unfamiliar business customs. The god who could mediate between gods and mortals, between life and death, could certainly mediate between Greek traders and foreign markets. The Roman god Mercury, who the Romans identified with Hermes, took on even stronger commercial associations. The Romans were even more trade-oriented than the Greeks, building a vast commercial empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. Mercury became one of the most important gods in the Roman pantheon, with temples throughout the empire and his image on countless coins. The English word merchant and related terms like merchandise and mercantile all derive from Mercury's name, showing how thoroughly this god became identified with commerce. In Roman practice, merchants celebrated the festival of Mercurialia on May 15th each year. They would go to Mercury's temple near the Circus Maximus in Rome, pray for profitable business in the coming year, and sprinkle themselves with water from a sacred spring associated with the god. The festival acknowledged that commercial success required both skill and divine favor, and merchants wanted to ensure they had both. The connection between Hermes, Mercury, and commerce remains visible today in several ways. The planet Mercury, named for the Roman god, is the fastest planet in its orbit, a fitting association for the god of speed and quick transactions. The medical symbol of the caduceus, though often confused with the rod of Asclepius, appears on hospitals and pharmacies, showing how Hermes' staff became associated with healing and care, another form of service and exchange. And when NASA named their first human spaceflight program Mercury, they were invoking the god Speed, just as merchants in ancient Athens invoked it when making deals in the Agora. What's fascinating about Hermes' role as commercial god is that it validated an entire aspect of human life that could have been seen as merely materialistic or even shameful. By making commerce divine, by placing it under the protection of one of the Olympian gods, Greek religion was saying that economic activity, buying, selling, trading, profit-making, was not just acceptable but sacred. The marketplace was holy ground. Business deals were blessed by the gods, and merchants were not just tolerated but honored. This religious validation of commerce helped ancient Greek civilization flourish. Cities like Athens, Corinth, and later Alexandria became trading powerhouses, their wealth built on commercial networks that stretched across the known world. Merchants weren't just tolerated as necessary evils, they were respected as essential contributors to civic life, under the protection of a god who himself was one of Zeus's trusted inner circle. Hermes, the god of merchants, taught the Greeks that creating wealth through trade was not theft or exploitation, but a valuable service, connecting those who had goods with those who needed them, moving resources from where they were abundant to where they were scarce, taking risk to generate profit that benefited everyone involved. In Hermes' commercial role, the Greeks found divine sanction. for their entrepreneurial spirit, their love of clever dealing, and their understanding that prosperity came not just from what you produced, but from how skillfully you exchanged it. Framorser, guardian of the road, protector of travelers in the ancient world. Travel was dangerous. Roads passed through wilderness where bandits lurked. Ships crossed seas where storms could destroy entire fleets. Travelers left the protection of their cities and ventured into unknown territories where they couldn't be sure of finding food, shelter, or friendly faces. Anyone who journeyed, whether a merchant traveling for trade, soldier marching to war, athlete going to games, or pilgrim visiting sacred sites, placed themselves at risk. They needed divine protection, and Hermes was the god who provided it. Hermes' role as protector of travelers grew naturally from his identity as the messenger god. A messenger is essentially a professional traveler, someone whose job requires constant movement from place to place. Hermes flying through the sky on winged sandals, traversing all roads and paths, moving between realms that ordinary mortals couldn't even visit, was the ultimate traveler. It made perfect sense that he would extend his protection to all who traveled in his footsteps. The Hermes that dotted the landscape of ancient Greece served primarily as travelers' aids. These stone pillars weren't just religious symbols. They were practical tools that helped people find their way. Placed at crossroads, they showed travelers which directions roads led. Placed at city boundaries, they marked where one territory ended and another began. Placed along lonely stretches of road, they provided landmarks that reassured travelers they were on the right path. In a world without maps or signposts, Hermes were the GPS of the ancient traveler. But Hermes served a religious function too. Travelers would stop at a Hermes to make offerings. A small prayer, a libation of wine, a bit of food left at the pillar's base. These offerings asked Hermes for protection on the journey ahead. Sometimes travelers would add a stone to the pile around a Hermes, a practice that over generations built up substantial cairns. Each stone represented a traveler who had passed safely, and adding your own stone was both thanksgiving for reaching that point and a prayer for protection going forward. The Greeks developed elaborate customs around hospitality, the practice of welcoming strangers, feeding them, offering them shelter, and these customs were considered sacred. Zeus himself, along with Hermes, presided over the laws of Xenia, guest friendship or hospitality, to turn away a traveler who asked for help, to refuse food or shelter to someone on the road, to harm a guest. These weren't just rude or illegal. They were sacrilegious offenses against the gods who protected travelers. This divine protection of hospitality was crucial in a world of city-states and frequent travel. Greeks needed to know that when they traveled to other cities, they would be welcomed and protected rather than enslaved or killed. The Xenia system, backed by divine law, created a network of mutual obligation where citizens of one city were expected to host citizens of another, knowing that when their own citizens traveled, they would receive similar treatment. Hermes, as god of travelers, enforced this system spiritually. Many Greek myths involve travelers being tested through hospitality. A common pattern has gods or heroes disguising themselves as poor travelers, arriving at someone's door and asking for food or shelter. How the homeowner responds determines their fate. Those who welcome the disguised traveler are rewarded. Those who turn them away are punished. These stories reinforced the message that travelers were under divine protection, and mistreating them brought divine punishment. One famous myth involved Zeus and Hermes traveling together, disguised as poor wayfarers. They went from house to house in Phrygia, asking for hospitality, and were refused by everyone until they reached the humble cottage of an elderly couple, Philemon and Baucis. Despite their poverty, the old couple welcomed the strangers, shared what little food they had, and treated the guests with genuine kindness. Only after receiving this hospitality did Zeus and Hermes reveal their divine identities. They rewarded Philemon and Baucis, transforming their cottage into a temple and granting their wish to die together rather than one outliving the other. Meanwhile, the inhospitable neighbors who had turned the gods away suffered flood and destruction. The moral was clear. Travelers must be welcomed, because you never know when a traveler might be a god in disguise. Hermes also protected specific types of travelers: pilgrims going to religious sites, athletes traveling to competitions, merchants on trading missions, soldiers marching to war. All could invoke Hermes' protection. Before setting out on any significant journey, Greeks would make offerings to Hermes, asking the god to watch over them on the road, protect them from dangers, and ensure they reach their destination safely. The god's protection extended beyond physical safety. Getting lost was another danger of ancient travel, potentially more dangerous than bandits, because you might wander for days without finding your way back. Hermes, as god of roads and boundaries, helped travelers find the correct paths. Some traditions held that Hermes would appear to lost travelers in dreams, showing them the way. Others suggested that the god guided people through instinct, that feeling of this is the right direction, that sometimes comes when you're uncertain. Whether through explicit visions or subtle guidance, Hermes helped travelers navigate the physical landscape. There was also a psychological dimension to Hermes' protection. Travel in the ancient world was often lonely and frightening. Roads passed through empty lands where you might go days without seeing another person. Wilderness stretched in all directions. Night fell without streetlights or safe havens. In such isolation, the knowledge that Hermes watched over travelers provided comfort. You weren't truly alone. The god himself traveled with you, invisible but present, ready to help if danger arose. Hermes' winged sandals became a symbol of travel itself. Ancient travelers would sometimes inscribe or paint images of winged sandals on their belongings, on travel bags, on walking sticks, on the sides of ships, as a way of invoking Hermes' protection. The image said, "I travel under the god's protection. I am sacred to Hermes. Harm me at your peril." It was both a religious symbol and a practical warning to potential robbers that this traveler was under divine protection. The god's protection of travelers also extended to a specific moment: departure. The Greeks had customs around saying goodbye to travelers, and these involved asking Hermes to watch over the journey. Families would gather at dawn when someone was leaving on a journey, pour libations to Hermes, say prayers for safe travel, and then watch as their loved one walked away down the road. The morning libation to Hermes was seen as essential. You didn't want someone you loved traveling without the god's protection. Hermes also protected nighttime travelers specifically. Ancient roads were dangerous enough in daylight. After dark, they became extremely perilous. Yet sometimes nighttime travel was necessary. Merchants trying to reach a destination before dawn, messengers carrying urgent news, people fleeing danger. Hermes as god of transitions, including the transition from day to night, watched over these night travelers especially. There are accounts of people traveling after dark who reported feeling a divine presence, a sense of being guided and protected that they attributed to Hermes. The Roman god Mercury maintained these same protective functions. Roman roads, which were more formalized and better maintained than most Greek roads, still required divine protection. Mercury's temples often stood at significant points along major roads, and travelers would stop to make offerings. The Roman army, which spent much of its time marching from province to province, held Mercury in particular regard as a god who could ensure safe military travel. In the modern world, we still invoke Hermes symbolically when we travel. The idea of a patron saint of travelers, in Christian tradition, Saint Christopher, follows the same pattern as Hermes' protection. When we wish someone safe travels or bon voyage, we're expressing the same hope that ancient Greeks expressed when they prayed to Hermes. When we place travel stickers on our luggage or hang charms from our rearview mirrors, we're continuing the ancient practice of marking ourselves as travelers under divine protection. Hermes' role as guardian of travelers speaks to a universal human concern, the fear and uncertainty of leaving home, of venturing into the unknown, of trusting that we'll reach our destination safely. By making travel itself sacred, by placing it under divine protection, Greek religion acknowledged both the necessity and the danger of movement between places. And by giving that protection to Hermes, specifically, the quick-footed god who knew every road, who could cross any boundary, who moved between worlds as easily as mortals moved between cities. They chose the perfect divine guardian for all who journey away from home. Guide of souls, the psychopomp among all of Hermes' roles. Perhaps none was more important or more awe-inspiring to the ancient Greeks than his function as psychopomp, the guide of souls to the underworld. This role placed Hermes at the very threshold between life and death, made him the divine presence that every mortal would eventually encounter, and established him as a deity of both comfort and fearful power. As psychopomp, Hermes didn't just protect travelers on earthly roads. He guided the ultimate journey that every human must make. The word psychopomp comes from the Greek psychopompos, meaning guide of souls or conductor of souls. Psyche means soul or spirit, and pompos means guide or conductor. In this role, Hermes took on the profound responsibility of escorting the newly dead from the world of the living down into Hades, the realm of the dead ruled by the god of the same name. Without Hermes' guidance, Greek belief held, souls might wander the earth as lost ghosts, unable to find their way to the underworld, forever trapped in a twilight existence. The journey from life to death was conceived as a literal journey, a trek from the upper world down into the depths where Hades had his kingdom. This underworld wasn't conceptually like the Christian hell. It wasn't primarily a place of punishment, though there were sections for that. Instead, it was simply the place where all the dead went, a shadowy realm where souls existed in a diminished state, like echoes of their former selves. But getting there required passing through various boundaries and obstacles, and a soul traveling alone might never complete the journey. Hermes' role began at the moment of death. When someone died, their psyche, their spirit or soul, separated from their body. This soul retained the appearance and consciousness of the person, but was now insubstantial, a shade rather than a flesh and blood being. Hermes would appear to this newly released soul and take on the role of guide. He would lead the soul on its journey from wherever the person died, down to the entrance to the underworld. The journey itself involved several stages. First, Hermes would lead the soul to the river Styx, or in some versions, one of the other underworld rivers, Acheron, Cocytus, Phlegethon, or Lethe. These waters separated the world of the living from the world of the dead, and they could only be crossed with the help of Charon, the grim ferryman who had rowed souls across these waters since time immemorial. Charon required payment for his service, typically an obol, a small coin placed in the mouth of the deceased before burial. Those who couldn't pay were supposedly left to wander the riverbanks for 100 years, before finally being allowed to cross. Hermes would deliver the soul to Charon, ensuring that the ferryman accepted this new passenger. There are artistic depictions from ancient Greece showing Hermes standing on the bank of the Styx with newly dead souls, gesturing toward Charon's boat, sometimes even helping souls board. The visual imagery is poignant. The swift god with winged sandals, known for his speed and constant motion, gently guiding the dead on their final one-way journey. After crossing the river, souls would face Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of Hades. Cerberus had a peculiar job. He allowed all souls to enter the underworld, but prevented any from leaving. The dead could pass him going in. The living, or the dead trying to escape, could not pass him going out. Hermes would guide souls past Cerberus and into Hades proper, where they would then proceed to judgment. In the underworld, 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, determined each soul's ultimate fate based on how they had lived. Most souls went to the Asphodel Meadows, a neutral middle ground where the majority of the dead spent eternity in a kind of gray existence. Particularly virtuous souls might be sent to Elysium, a paradise within the underworld. The truly wicked were condemned to Tartarus, the deepest pit, where they suffered eternal punishment. But before any of this happened, Hermes had to deliver the soul safely to the judges, completing his role as guide. The Greeks took this function of Hermes so seriously that proper burial rites always included provisions for the soul's journey. Bodies were buried with a coin for Charon's fee. Families would pray to Hermes at funerals, asking him to guide their loved one's soul safely to the underworld. Some epitaphs included appeals to Hermes directly, inscribed on tombstones. Hermes Psychopompos, guide this soul kindly. The god's psychopomp role was intimately connected to the actual practices of death and burial. Several famous myths involve Hermes in his psychopomp capacity. In Homer's Odyssey, Book 24, Hermes leads the souls of Penelope's slain suitors down to Hades after Odysseus kills them. The passage is hauntingly beautiful. Homer describes Hermes taking up his golden staff, calling forth the souls and leading them as they gibbered and squeaked behind him like bats. They traveled past the streams of Oceanus, past the White Rock, past the gates of the sun, until they reached the meadow of Asphodel, where the dead dwell. There, Hermes left them to their eternal rest, having completed his task of guidance. In another myth, Hermes plays a crucial role in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. When Orpheus, the greatest musician who ever lived, descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice, he managed to convince Hades and Persephone to let her return to life. But there was a condition. Orpheus had to walk back up to the world of the living with Eurydice following behind him, and he could not look back at her until they both reached the surface. If he looked back, well, she would be lost forever. As they climbed upward through the dark passages, Orpheus began to doubt. Was Eurydice really behind him? Or was this a trick? Finally, just before reaching the surface, he couldn't help himself and looked back. Eurydice was there, reaching out for him, but the moment he looked, she faded and was pulled back down into death's domain. Hermes appears in many versions of this myth as the god who initially leads Eurydice back from the underworld and then, tragically, must lead her back down when Orpheus breaks the condition. Hermes' psychopomp role extended beyond just guiding the dead. He was also the god who could cross between life and death in both directions. While dead souls traveled only one way, from life to death, Hermes could travel both ways. This made him invaluable for the rare occasions when living heroes needed to visit the underworld and return. Heracles, during his 12 labors, had to descend to Hades and capture Cerberus. Hermes and Athena both helped guide him on this impossible journey. Aeneas, in Virgil's Aeneid, visits his father's shade in the underworld with divine guidance. The god's ability to move between realms, living and dead, light and darkness, above and below, made him unique even among the Olympians. Most gods stayed in their own domains. Hades ruled the underworld, but rarely left it. The other Olympians lived on Mount Olympus and visited Earth, but avoided the realm of death. Only Hermes moved freely between all three realms: Olympus, home of gods; Earth, home of mortals; and Hades, home of the dead. This threefold access granted Hermes a kind of authority over transitions, over the movement between states of being. Hermes was also associated with sleep and dreams, which the Greeks saw as related to death. Sleep was described as death's brother. Dreams were visits to shadowy realms that resembled the underworld. Hermes, as psychopomp, naturally became associated with these nightly journeys of the soul. The Greeks believed that when you slept, your soul temporarily left your body and wandered in a dream realm. Hermes guided these wanderings, protecting sleepers and sending meaningful dreams. His staff, the caduceus, had the power to bring sleep, and this was another aspect of his guide of souls function, guiding souls not just in death, but in the temporary death-like state of sleep. Before going to bed, ancient Greeks would often pour a final libation to Hermes, asking him to send good dreams and protect them during sleep. There's something touching about this practice, the recognition that even sleep, that daily necessity, was a kind of journey that required divine protection. Hermes, who guided the dead to their final rest, also guided the living through their nightly rest, ensuring they would wake up again in the morning. In psychological and philosophical terms, Hermes' psychopomp role has been interpreted as representing the human need for guidance during transitions. Death is the ultimate transition, the most profound boundary crossing imaginable. The belief that Hermes guided this crossing suggested that even in death, even in that ultimate unknowable moment, humans were not abandoned. A divine presence accompanied them, someone who knew the way, who had made this journey countless times before, who could be trusted to deliver them safely to whatever lay beyond. Modern psychology has picked up on this symbolism. Carl Jung and his followers wrote extensively about Hermes as a guide figure, an archetypal psychopomp who appears not just at physical death but at psychological transitions, moments when the ego must die and be reborn, when old patterns must be released to make way for new growth. The Hermetic tradition in Western esotericism, drawing heavily on Hermes Mercury symbolism, uses the god as a symbol of spiritual transformation and the guide that helps souls navigate inner realms. The idea of a psychopomp, a guide for the dying, appears in many cultures. Egypt had Anubis, the jackal-headed god who weighed souls and guided them through the afterlife. Norse mythology had the Valkyries, who chose which warriors would die in battle and escorted them to Valhalla. Christian tradition developed the concept of guardian angels who accompany souls at death. The universality of this concept suggests something fundamental about human psychology. We need to believe that death, that final journey, is not made alone. Hermes, as the Greek psychopomp, embodied this need in a particularly Greek way. He wasn't grim or fearsome, unlike Thanatos, the actual god of death, who was portrayed as dark and frightening. Hermes was swift, clever, friendly, the same god who protected travelers and merchants and thieves. This made death less terrifying. If Hermes, that helpful god who guided you on earthly journeys, was the one who would guide your soul after death, then perhaps death wasn't something to fear quite so much. You were in good hands, traveling under divine protection, just as you had been protected when traveling roads during life. In Hermes' psychopomp role, the Greeks found a way to make death less alien, less terrifying. Death became another journey, a final road to travel, with the same god who had watched over all your other journeys now watching over this one. It was Hermes' final gift to humanity, the promise that when the last boundary must be crossed, when the ultimate journey must be made, the swift god with winged sandals would be there to guide the way. The many talents, inventor and patron. One of the most remarkable aspects of Hermes' mythology is the sheer number of skills, arts, and activities that the Greeks attributed to him. He wasn't content to be merely messenger and guide. He was also inventor, innovator, and patron of numerous human endeavors. From music to athletics, from astronomy to animal husbandry, Hermes had his quick-fingered involvement everywhere. This versatility made him one of the most relatable gods in the pantheon. Wherever you looked in Greek culture, Hermes had contributed something essential. We've already discussed Hermes' invention of the lyre on his first day of life, but it's worth revisiting the significance of this achievement. The lyre became the most important musical instrument in ancient Greek culture. It was used to accompany poetry, to perform at festivals, to teach music to children, to entertain at symposia. Professional musicians called rhapsodes performed Homer's epics while playing the lyre. At the Pythian Games, second in importance only to the Olympics, musical contests featured lyre playing prominently. All of this musical tradition traced back, according to myth, to baby Hermes making the first lyre from a tortoiseshell, oxhide, and sheep gut. But Hermes didn't stop at the lyre. He also invented the panpipes, or syrinx, that set of reed pipes bound together and played by blowing across their tops. The panpipes became the signature instrument of shepherds, who would play them while tending their flocks in the hills. The sound was haunting, pastoral, associated with the countryside and with Pan, the goat-footed god who was Hermes' son. Through the Syrinx, Hermes' musical innovations reached into rustic life, not just the formal culture of cities. Some traditions credited Hermes with inventing music itself, or at least bringing it to humanity in an organized form. This makes symbolic sense. Music is a form of communication that transcends words, and Hermes, as god of communication, naturally presided over this most profound way humans express themselves and connect with each other. Music, like messages, travels from one person to another. It bridges distances, touches emotions, creates shared experience. Hermes, the bridge builder between separated things, was the perfect god to give music to the world. Beyond music, Hermes was credited with inventing several other crucial elements of Greek civilization. According to various traditions, he invented the alphabet, or at least brought writing to humanity. This attribution made perfect sense. Hermes was god of language and communication, and writing was communication preserved across time and space. The ability to record messages permanently, to send information to distant places or distant times, was an extension of Hermes' messenger function. Some myths specified that Hermes created the Greek alphabet by watching cranes fly in formation, seeing how their V-shaped patterns resembled letters. Hermes was also said to have invented or taught humanity various athletic activities. The Greeks were passionate about athletics, holding regular games at Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and Corinth. These games weren't just sporting events. They were religious festivals honoring the gods. Hermes, as patron of athletes, presided over many of these contests. Wrestling, in particular, was associated with Hermes, and athletes would pray to him before matches. The gymnasium, that central institution of Greek education, where boys trained physically and intellectually, was under Hermes' protection. Some myths credit Hermes with inventing boxing as well. The connection between Hermes and combat sports might seem odd for a god not usually associated with warfare, but it makes sense when you consider what these sports required. Speed, agility, cunning, quick thinking, all qualities Hermes embodied. Boxing and wrestling weren't about brute strength, but about using your mind to outthink your opponent, moving quickly to dodge their attacks while landing your own. These were hermetic qualities applied to athletic contest. Hermes also had deep connections to animal husbandry and pastoral life. Before becoming Zeus's messenger, he was a shepherd god, protector of flocks and herds in rural areas of Greece, especially in his traditional home region of Arcadia. Hermes was primarily worshipped as a god of cattle, sheep, and goats. Shepherds would pray to him for the safety and fertility of their animals, for protection from predators, for the skills needed to tend flocks successfully. This pastoral aspect of Hermes was important in Greek culture, which remained closely connected to rural agricultural life, even in its most urbanized periods. The majority of Greeks made their living from farming and animal husbandry. Having a god who understood these concerns, who protected flocks as he protected travelers and merchants, made Hermes accessible and relevant to ordinary people's lives. He wasn't just an elite god of merchants and athletes. He was also the god of the common shepherd in the hills. Astronomy and astrology were also linked to Hermes. Some traditions held that he taught humanity to read the stars, to understand the movements of celestial bodies, to use astronomical knowledge for navigation and timekeeping. This makes sense given Hermes' role as traveler and guide. The stars were crucial for navigation, especially at night or at sea. By teaching astronomy, Hermes was essentially sharing the divine knowledge that allowed him to find his way anywhere, giving humans some of the same orientation that gods possess naturally. The connection between Hermes and astronomy persists today in the name of the planet Mercury, which was called the Star of Hermes by the Greeks. Mercury is the fastest moving planet visible to the naked eye, zipping around the sun in just 88 days. The ancient Greeks, watching it race across the sky, saw a perfect correlation with their swift-footed messenger god. The planet's speed and its position close to the sun, as Hermes was close to Zeus, made the association natural. Hermes was also credited with teaching humans various practical skills related to commerce and to communication. Some traditions held that he invented systems of weights and measures, allowing for standardized trade. He supposedly taught humans how to make fire, though this claim competed with Prometheus's myth. He showed humans how to make sacrifices to the gods properly. Recall that on his first day, he invented the ritual form that sacrifices would take thereafter. In later periods, especially in Hellenistic and Roman times, Hermes Mercury became associated with even more esoteric knowledge. He was linked to alchemy, magic, and various mystery traditions. The Hermetic texts, philosophical and religious writings, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a combination of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, treated the god as the source of secret wisdom about the nature of reality, the divine, and the human soul. While these later developments went far beyond original Greek mythology, they showed Hermes' continuing evolution as the god of knowledge and communication. What's striking about all of Hermes' inventions and patronages is their diversity. He wasn't a specialist deity with one narrow domain. He was a generalist who touched almost every aspect of human life: music, writing, athletics, commerce, animal care, astronomy, technology. Hermes had contributed to all of them. This versatility reflected the Greek understanding that communication, movement, and clever thinking were fundamental to everything humans did. Whether you were composing a song or tending sheep, trading goods or wrestling an opponent, writing a letter or reading the stars, you were engaging in activities that required the same basic qualities: intelligence, skill, communication, and the ability to cross boundaries and make connections. Hermes' many inventions also established him as a culture hero, a divine figure who taught humanity essential skills and knowledge. Most cultures have such figures. Prometheus brought fire, Athena taught various crafts, Demeter gave agriculture. Hermes' contributions were distinctive in focusing on communication, movement, and innovation. He gave humans the tools to express themselves: music, writing, to compete and excel, athletics, to conduct business, weights, measures, and to understand the world, astronomy. These weren't just practical skills. They were the foundations of civilization itself. In modern terms, Hermes would be the god of education, technology, communication systems, and all forms of knowledge sharing. He'd preside over the internet, over telecommunications, over the systems that allow information to flow freely between people. He'd be patron of teachers, writers, programmers, musicians, athletes, and anyone else who communicates, creates, or innovates. His versatility makes him perpetually relevant. Wherever humans are trying to connect with each other, share information, or create something new, they're working in Hermes' domain. Family and offspring, children of the swift god. Hermes, for all his constant motion and perpetual travel, found time for romantic relationships, and like most male Olympian gods, he fathered numerous children. His offspring inherited various aspects of their father's nature: his cleverness, his connection to boundaries and transitions, his association with the wild places. Some of these children became gods in their own right. Others achieved fame as heroes or legendary figures, and still others represented abstract qualities that extended Hermes' domains into new areas. The most famous of Hermes' divine children was Pan, the goat-footed god of shepherds, wild places, and untamed nature. Pan's mother was usually identified as Dryope, a nymph, though some versions name different mothers, including the nymph Penelope, or even Odysseus' wife Penelope, in very confused traditions. According to the myth, when Pan was born, his mother was horrified by his appearance. He had the legs, horns, and beard of a goat, along with a more or less human torso and face. She abandoned the baby in terror. But Hermes, delighted with his strange offspring, wrapped Pan in hare skins and carried him up to Olympus to show the other gods. The Olympians were charmed by the baby's wild appearance and strange nature, and Pan became a beloved, if minor deity. Pan inherited his father's association with shepherds and flocks, becoming the primary god of pastoral life. He was said to inhabit wild mountains and forests, playing his panpipes and occasionally appearing to lonely shepherds. Pan's music had magical properties. It could cause panic, a sudden irrational fear that might seize people in lonely places, making them run wildly without knowing why. This word, panic, derives directly from Pan's name, as ancient Greeks believed these sudden terrors were caused by the god's presence. Pan inherited Hermes' association with boundaries and liminal spaces, but expressed it differently. Where Hermes crossed boundaries through swift movement and clever thinking, Pan lived permanently in boundary spaces, in the wild areas between civilization and wilderness, in caves that connected the surface world to underground depths. In the hours of dawn and dusk, when day transitioned to night, Pan was his father's son in being a god of thresholds, but stationary rather than mobile, embodying permanent liminality rather than constant movement. Another significant child of Hermes was Hermaphroditus, whose very name combined Hermes with Aphrodite, his mother. According to the myth, Hermaphroditus was born male and beautiful, inheriting looks from both his divine parents. As a young man, he encountered the nymph Salmacis at her spring. She fell desperately in love with him, but he rejected her advances. When Hermaphroditus entered her spring to bathe, Salmacis seized the opportunity, embraced him, and prayed to the gods that they would never be separated. The gods granted her wish in an unexpected way. They merged Salmacis and Hermaphroditus into a single being that was both male and female, neither and both at once. Hermaphroditus, as a deity, represented gender, fluidity, and the merging of male and female natures. The myth acknowledged that gender exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary, that male and female could combine in a single being. That this child came from Hermes and Aphrodite made perfect sense. Hermes, god of boundaries and their transgression, combined with Aphrodite, goddess of sexual love, produced offspring who transcended the boundary between genders. Among Hermes's mortal children, the most famous was probably Autolycus, whom we've already mentioned. Autolycus inherited his father's talents for theft and deception, becoming the most successful thief in Greek mythology. Hermes granted him supernatural abilities. Whatever Autolycus stole became unrecognizable, and he could change his own appearance at will. These gifts made him nearly impossible to catch or convict, as neither the stolen goods nor the thief could be identified with certainty. Autolycus had his own famous descendant, his grandson Odysseus, hero of the Odyssey and renowned as the cleverest of all Greek heroes. Odysseus's cunning, his talent for lies and deception, his ability to talk his way out of impossible situations, his cleverness in devising solutions others couldn't imagine. All of these trace back through Autolycus to Hermes himself. The god's blood ran strong in this lineage, making Odysseus a human embodiment of hermetic qualities. Hermes had another notable son named Abderos, who became the companion and probably lover of the hero Heracles. Abderos helped Heracles with his eighth labor, capturing the man-eating horses of Diomedes. Tragically, Abderos was killed by those same horses, devoured by them when left in his care. Heracles, devastated by his companion's death, founded a city and games in Abderos's memory. The boy's fate was unfortunate, but it showed how even Hermes' children, despite divine parentage, remained vulnerable to mortal dangers. Several other children of Hermes appear in various myths. Eudoros was a warrior in the Trojan War, one of the captains serving under Achilles. Polyestra was goddess of wrestling, naturally inheriting her father's athletic associations. Myrtilus, a skilled charioteer, played a role in the myth of Pelops and the founding of the Olympic Games. Abderus, Priapus, in some versions, and various nymphs and minor deities could all claim Hermes as father. What's interesting about Hermes' children is how they extended his domains into new areas. Pan took Hermes' pastoral nature and made it central. Hermaphroditus took the boundary-crossing nature and applied it to gender. Autolycus took the thievery and made it into a profession. Each child represented a different aspect of their multifaceted father, specialized in one particular hermetic quality, rather than possessing all of them. Hermes' romantic relationships were varied. Unlike Zeus, whose conquests were legendary and often problematic, Hermes seems to have had relatively friendly relationships with his lovers. There's no parade of myths about Hermes pursuing unwilling partners or about Hera taking revenge on his lovers. Perhaps because Hermes wasn't married, unlike most male Olympians, his affairs caused less drama. Or perhaps his cleverness extended to managing relationships diplomatically, avoiding the conflicts that other gods created through their romantic lives. Some sources link Hermes romantically with Aphrodite, making them not just parents of Hermaphroditus, but lovers over an extended period. Given Hermes' cleverness and Aphrodite's connection to love and beauty, this pairing makes thematic sense. Both gods represented forms of connection and communication. Aphrodite through physical and emotional connection, Hermes through verbal and practical communication. Together they could create something, or someone, that bridged even more boundaries. Hermes was also connected to various nymphs, those minor nature deities who populated Greek mythology. Dryope, Chione, Penelope, the nymph, not Odysseus's wife, though the confusion has caused problems, and others bore children to Hermes. These relationships typically followed a standard pattern. Hermes encountered a beautiful nymph. They had relations, usually consensual in the myths. Unlike some of Zeus's encounters, she bore his child, and Hermes acknowledged the offspring before moving on to his many duties. These weren't grand romantic tragedies. They were brief encounters that produced significant offspring. The legacy of Hermes through his children was one of cleverness, boundary crossing, and the wild or marginal aspects of life. His children weren't kings or emperors ruling cities. They were thieves, shepherds, wrestlers, gender transgressive deities. They lived on the edges, in the wild places, in the spaces between categories. This made perfect sense. Hermes himself was the god of margins and edges, of the places and moments between things. His children inherited his marginal nature, becoming divine and heroic figures who didn't fit neatly into conventional categories. In mythological terms, these children showed how divine qualities could be inherited and specialized. Zeus's children became major gods and heroes who ruled or performed great deeds. Poseidon's children were often giants or monsters connected to the sea. Hermes' children were tricksters, clever operators, beings who existed between categories and excelled in liminal spaces. Through his offspring, Hermes' influence extended beyond his own myths into entire new areas of Greek cultural life. Symbols and worship. From ancient Greece to modern times, Hermes was one of the most widely worshipped gods in ancient Greece, and his symbols were among the most recognizable in the entire pantheon. Even today, thousands of years after the last Greek sacrifices to Hermes, his imagery remains potent and his influence visible in unexpected places. Understanding how the Greeks worshipped Hermes and what his symbols meant provides insight not just into ancient religion, but into how mythological symbolism continues to shape our world. The most famous symbol of Hermes was the caduceus, that staff entwined with two serpents and often topped with wings. We have discussed its practical uses, inducing sleep, providing safe passage, but the symbolism runs deeper. The intertwined serpents represented several things: the reconciliation of opposites, the two snakes once fighting, now peaceful; wisdom and healing. Snakes were sacred to Apollo as well, and the Kundalini energy that some interpretations saw as flowing through the human body. The wings represented swift communication and thought. Together, the caduceus symbolized Hermes' role as a mediator who brought opposing forces into balance and facilitated communication. There's been significant confusion in modern times between Hermes' caduceus and the rod of Asclepius, a staff with a single snake, symbol of medicine and healing. Many medical organizations mistakenly use the caduceus as their symbol, when historically the rod of Asclepius was the proper medical emblem. This confusion probably arose because both symbols involved snakes on staffs, and because Hermes, as god of communication and travel, had some association with healers who traveled to treat patients. Nevertheless, the caduceus remains widely used in commercial medical contexts, even if technically incorrect. The winged sandals, talaria, were another unmistakable symbol. These represented Hermes' speed and his constant motion. but also his ability to travel freely between realms that normally kept apart. The wings indicated transcendence, the ability to rise above of earthly limitations. In art, the talaria were sometimes replaced by or supplemented with wings sprouting directly from Hermes' ankles, making the imagery even more dramatic. The petassos, that wide-brimmed traveler's hat, marked Hermes as perpetually on the move, never settling in one place. In many artistic depictions, the petassos was also winged, reinforcing the theme of flight and speed. When Greeks saw a figure in art wearing this characteristic hat, they immediately recognized Hermes or identified the figure as a traveler under Hermes' protection. Perhaps the most distinctive symbol, and certainly the most widespread, was the Herm itself. These pillars, which gave Hermes his name, or vice versa, the etymology is debated, stood throughout the Greek world. In cities, they marked public spaces, boundaries, and important locations. Along roads, they provided waypoints and shrines for travelers. At the entrances to homes, they served as protective talismans. Herms were ubiquitous in ancient Greece, making Hermes' presence felt everywhere. The not typical Herm was a rectangular stone pillar, with a carved head of Hermes at the top, bearded in early versions, youthful and clean-shaven in later ones, and a phallus carved or protruding at about waist height. The phallus wasn't meant to be obscene. It was an apotropaic symbol, meant to ward off evil and a representation of Hermes' fertility aspects. Many Herms also featured the kerykeion carved into the stone. Over time, Herms became so common that they were almost invisible to Greeks, just part of the landscape, like street signs or mailboxes in a modern city. The widespread nature of Herms throughout Greece made Hermes one of the most present gods in daily life. You couldn't walk through an ancient Greek city without encountering multiple Herms. Every time you passed one, you were reminded of Hermes' protection, of his watchfulness, of his connection to boundaries and travel. This constant visual presence made Hermes feel accessible and immediate in ways that other gods, confined to temples, might not. Other symbols associated with Hermes included the tortoise, from his invention of the lyre, the rooster, a bird connected to heralds and morning messages, the ram, pastoral connections, and the palm tree. Various animals and plants appeared in Hermes iconography, depending on which aspect of the god was being emphasized. For travelers, images of roads and boundary stones. For merchants, scales and coins. For shepherds, rams and flocks. Worship of Hermes took several forms. In cities, there were temples dedicated to him, though fewer than gods like Zeus, Athena, or Apollo received. The relative scarcity of grand temples made sense. Hermes wasn't a god you needed an elaborate building to reach. His Herms were his temples, his roadside shrines more accessible than any grand structure. At these Herms and at his formal temples, worshippers would make offerings: food, wine, flowers, small coins. Travelers would stop to ask for protection. Merchants would pray for successful deals. Thieves would quietly ask for luck in their endeavors. The Hermaia was an annual festival in Athens honoring Hermes, particularly in his role as patron of athletes and youths. Young men would compete in athletic contests, race, wrestle, and perform other feats. The festival acknowledged Hermes' connection to competition, skill, and the energy of youth. Similar festivals were held in other Greek cities, each emphasizing slightly different aspects of Hermes' multifaceted nature depending on local needs and traditions. One unusual practice connected to Hermes worship was the construction of stone cairns at crossroads and along roads. Travelers would add a stone to existing piles, both as offering and as marker. Over time, these cairns could grow quite large, becoming almost like collaborative sculptures that whole communities built one stone at a time. Each stone represented a journey safely completed and a prayer for future protection. The practice continued in various forms in many cultures. You can still find stone cairns built by hikers at mountain passes today, unconsciously continuing this ancient tradition. When Romans encountered Greek religion, they immediately identified Hermes with their own god Mercury. Mercury had existed in Roman religion before Greek influence, probably as an indigenous Italic deity, but he absorbed most of Hermes' characteristics and myths. The Romans, however, emphasized Mercury's commercial aspects even more strongly than the Greeks had emphasized Hermes. Mercury became primarily the god of merchants, trade, and profit, though he retained his messenger and travel functions. Roman merchants worshiped Mercury intensely, building temples at market centers throughout the empire. The Roman festival of Mercurialia, celebrated on May 15th, was almost entirely focused on commerce. Merchants would go to Mercury's temple, sprinkle themselves with water from his sacred well, and pray for commercial success in the coming year. They might offer Mercury a portion of their profits in thanks for past success. The festival acknowledged that business required both skill and luck, and Mercury provided both. As Christianity gradually replaced pagan religion in the late Roman Empire and Middle Ages, worship of Hermes toward Mercury officially ended. But the god's influence didn't disappear. Many Christian saints took on functions similar to Hermes, particularly Saint Christopher, who became patron saint of travelers. The practice of praying for safe travel, of seeking divine protection on journeys, continued under Christian forms after the Hermetic forms faded. In the Renaissance, Hermes experienced a revival through the Hermetic tradition. Texts attributed to were Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure combining Greek Hermes with Egyptian Thoth, gained enormous popularity among scholars. These Hermetic writings, dealing with philosophy, alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, presented Hermes as a source of ancient wisdom that predated both Greek and Christian revelation. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino translated and studied these texts, and Hermetic symbols became central to Western esotericism. This Hermetic revival, while not the same as ancient Greek worship, kept Hermes' name and image alive through centuries when other pagan gods were largely forgotten. Alchemists used the caduceus as a symbol. Magicians invoked Hermes Trismegistus in their rituals. Philosophers incorporated Hermetic ideas into their thinking. Through these channels, Hermes remained culturally present in ways that, say, Hephaestus or Dionysus did not. In the modern era, Hermes appears everywhere if you know where to look. The planet Mercury keeps his Roman name. The element Mercury, Quicksilver, named for its liquid mobility, references the swift god. Companies use the name Mercury or Hermes for products associated with speed or communication. Mercury Marine makes boat motors. Hermes, the French luxury brand, though they pronounce it differently, implies swift delivery. FTD Florists uses the caduceus in their logo, playing on Hermes as god of delivery. The International Express Mail Service uses EMS with wings, evoking Mercury's winged sandals. Medical organizations continue using the caduceus incorrectly, as we noted. The symbol appears on ambulances, medical school insignia, and various health-related logos. While this usage may be historically confused, it demonstrates that Hermes' symbols retain visual power and meaning even for people who don't know the myths behind them. In modern paganism, particularly in Hellenic polytheistic revivals, Hermes is actively worshipped again. Contemporary pagans make offerings at boundary stones, pray to Hermes before travel, and celebrate festivals in his honor. While these modern practices don't exactly replicate ancient Greek religion, we can never fully recover that context. They represent a living continuation of Hermes worship adapted for contemporary life. Hermes' enduring presence in our culture, from place names to medical symbols to neo-pagan practice, demonstrates mythology's continuing relevance. The god of communication, travel, and boundary crossing speaks to eternal human concerns that haven't changed despite technological advancement. We still need to travel safely. We still engage in commerce and trade. We still communicate across distances. We still face thresholds and transitions that require guidance. Hermes, that ancient trickster god born in a cave on Mount Selene, still has relevance for humans navigating these same challenges 3,000 years later. Conclusion, and so we reach the end of our journey through the mythology of Hermes, that swift-footed, quick-witted, multifaceted god who embodies so much of what it means to be human. Our need to communicate, to travel, to trade, to cross boundaries, both literal and metaphorical. From his miraculous birth and cattle theft as an infant, to his eternal role guiding souls to the underworld, Hermes has shown us a god who is both divinely powerful and delightfully relatable. Hermes reminds us that cleverness can triumph over strength, that communication is itself a form of power, that boundaries exist to be transgressed, and that the journey, whether across roads, between markets, or from life to death, is sacred. He teaches that trickery and honesty, thievery and fair dealing, playfulness and profound responsibility can coexist in the same character. He shows us that versatility is a gift, that moving between worlds and roles can be a divine calling. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the mythology of Hermes, the messenger god with winged sandals and a staff of guidance, please like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. Your support helps us continue bringing you these explorations of the myths that shaped human civilization and continue to resonate in our modern world. Share this with anyone interested in Greek mythology, ancient religion, or the fascinating ways the old gods still walk among us in symbol and story. Let us know in the comments which myth or deity you'd like us to explore next, and as you go about your day, traveling your own roads, making your own deals, sending your own messages, remember that you walk in the footsteps of those ancient travelers who looked to Hermes for protection. May you travel safely, communicate clearly, and find good fortune in all your dealings. Stay swift, stay clever, my friends, and may the winged god watch over all your journeys.